Welcome back, friends, to the second half of Economic Update. Before introducing my guest for today, I want to talk a little bit about the topic that we're going to be discussing. As I've mentioned, I'm a professor of economics. I've been doing that all my adult life. And I've had to face and struggle, as everybody else has in this profession, with a difficult, sad fact about economics education in colleges and universities in the United States for the last half century. Basically, the story is this. Because of the Cold War, because of the long years of struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that began in the late 1940s, the previous way of teaching economics, which included the presentation of alternative theories, of those theories that thought capitalism was a really good system and efficient and effective, and those who didn't, those who were critical, those who preferred alternative ways of thinking about economics, an alternative economic system. That kind of an economics that debated those questions was pushed aside. Instead, everything got narrowed to a very simple orthodoxy that excluded everything else. And the orthodoxy was the following. Capitalism, the economists told us, was the greatest economic system since sliced bread. It couldn't be improved upon. It couldn't be bested. It had no alternative that was worth studying in a sympathetic way, from which lessons might be learned. None of that. Marxism, which is the most developed critique of economic orthodoxy that exists in the world, it's the most developed critique of capitalism that exists in the world, was simply excluded from 99% of all economics curriculum as it is today. It's an extraordinary, narrow orthodoxy. And the reason I'm telling you this is I've asked to come and join us today a professor of economics who is one of those brave souls growing in number across the United States, and there were always a few, who doesn't want this orthodoxy to go on, who wants to open things up, and the phrase he and his colleagues use is heterodox economics, opening economics up to alternative perspectives, having students learn what's good about capitalism and what isn't, what the theories suggest might be a better system and what the theories suggest can't be improved on, but to open the space up. And that's a really important contribution to this country, particularly at this time when so many Americans understand all too well that capitalism, whatever its virtues, is not doing all that well by the majority of people. So let me turn to my guest and introduce him to you. He is Professor Ian Seda-Irizarry. He is an assistant professor of economics at the John Jay College of the City University of New York. There he teaches Introduction to Economics and Global Capitalism, Political Economy, Economic Development of the Caribbean, and Economics in Historical Perspective. He got his PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and his current work focuses on understanding the economic crisis of Puerto Rico, and his popular and academic writings have appeared in outlets inside and outside of the United States. So it really is with pleasure that I welcome to our program Professor Ian Seda-Irizarry. Thanks very much for joining.
Thank you, Rick, for having me yet again in your space, and for your viewers and listeners for tuning in.
Good. So tell me what you understand by this term heterodox economics. And I should preface my question by saying I'm going to be asking you about the fact that you've created at your college a master's program in heterodox economics. So I'm going to explore that with you. But let's begin by what is heterodox economics?
Well, as you mentioned in your introduction, heterodox economics is kind of an umbrella term for capturing alternative perspectives to the mainstream of the discipline, to the orthodoxy. So in that sense, it refers to the outside of the discipline. The concept itself also is kind of problematic because it doesn't necessarily imply that it's a critique of capitalism. It's just that it might be a different way, for example, of celebrating the system that's not on par with the mainstream. So in that sense, it's a very broad umbrella term. So it's not like what some people like to say that it's just like, radical political economy with a new name, right? Like here in New York City, people like to speak about, oh, salsa music is just mambo. No, it's a different thing. But we use that term to highlight the openness of alternatives to the orthodoxy.
Okay, so tell me, why is it necessary? Why did your colleagues and you choose to specifically designate your new master's economics programs as heterodox? Why choose that name at this time?
Well, against all attempts to silence alternatives, there has always been a demand for alternative viewpoints concerning the explanations of how the system works. And usually this demand for alternative viewpoints just explodes in moments of crisis of the system. So for example, in the 1970s, this happened. New textbooks were created, probably the most famous one, which sought to be an alternative to the classic Paul Samuelson introductory textbook, which is the Bible of the discipline, was a project by John Eatwell and John Robinson. That didn't get off the ground very well. Then you had at the turn of the century with that crisis that started around 97 and ended up in 2001 that cut countries like Russia, Argentina, Turkey. You had calls in countries like France from students in universities asking for changes in the curriculum. And with the latest downturn of the economy, we had the case, for example, of students walking out of the classes of somebody like Greg Mankiw, who right now is the most renowned author of the basic textbook that most economic students are willing and are expected actually to tackle and learn from. So in that sense, we are kind of a product of the ups and downs of the crisis, and specifically our department took the shape it took around 2008, 2009, which is, the critical years of, the downturn, the most recent downturn of the system. So we basically tapped into that demand, and we had, thankfully, which is kind of lucky, the support of the institution to precisely provide this alternative views to our students.
Okay, just for clarification, will your master's program also teach the mainstream or the conventional economics that the vast majority of other programs teach and only teach? In other words, will you include what the others don't include?
So in a sense, I have to be sincere, this is still a work in progress. There's a big, important debates within the department, within heterodoxy, in terms of how to address mainstream economics. So just to give you a good example of this, students many times, if you teach them the mainstream model and start criticizing at the end, they wonder, why did you teach me from the get-go something that you think is wrong? Why lose my time that way? So we're struggling with how to do it. Clearly, our students will be exposed in one way or another to the mainstream. They have to be able to criticize not only those economic theories, but also the political thought that emanates from those theories that they see, when they read a newspaper, see the television, see politicians speak about the state of the health of the economy, etc. So either directly or indirectly, our students are asked to precisely engage with the mainstream, or else we would be committing the same let's say, mistake that the orthodoxy commits in excluding us.
So you'll open it to everything and exclude nothing, basically, or you'll try to be as open as you can.
Yeah, but we won't lose our time in using the orthodoxy as the pillar from which then the classes are developed. On the contrary, it's more like we expose our students to the theories that we think make more sense of the world, and in occasional topics and occasional themes, we bring in the common sense that usually pervades analysis, which is usually tied to that particular theory. So we try to make those connections. It's a very difficult task, but we try to do it.
Okay, so in a sense, you're remedying a defect in the educational system when it comes to economics in higher education. It is narrow and orthodox. You want to be open and heterodox. Why do you think the rest of economics education in the United States is so orthodox? What is What's the reason for that? How would you explain to a person that you were describing the situation to why it's that way?
Well, we know that throughout the history of humanity, when systems of social thought have been developed, usually what becomes the mainstream becomes an argument for the status quo. So if you look, for example, in political theory in the 17th century, those turbulent times of the English Revolution, Civil War, Counter-Revolution, you had a Thomas Hobbes making an argument for the English monarchy. If you look in a discipline like philosophy, a couple of centuries later, you have Hegel making a whole argument about the virtues of the development of rational thought embodied in the Prussian state, in the Prussian monarchy. And now in economics, what we have is precisely mainstream orthodox neoclassical economics making an apologetic defense with no basic criticisms of how the system works in terms of this is the best we can have. So in that sense, we try to participate in undermining what becomes a mainstream that appeals to science and the processes of science in terms of why is it that they occupy that hegemonic role. They appeal to this, let's use the term positivism, in terms that science advances on the basis, to quote Paul Samuelson, who quoted Max Planck, in terms of, what was that, death by death, economics makes progress, or something like that. As if everybody agrees that these theories have been refuted, so we have to move on, and etc. So we question that those discourses that also, for example, appeal to methods such as extreme use of math and statistics, because supposedly math and statistics imply some sort of rigor, consistency, and therefore they equate it with the truth. So we also have those sensibilities about method in connection to politics and the system of ideas prevalent in a society. So to answer your question is very, very difficult, but we do know that it's not, the answer to that question is not that positivistic vision that is exposed to most students in terms of how the social sciences advance through time in societies that are populated by ideas that are consistently contending with each other.
So it's interesting to me to hear you say, particularly, that in every historical period, there has in fact been contestation between points of view that affirm the inevitability, the superiority of the status quo, and theories that say, no, we can do better as human beings than this system or this structure, and we have at least to discuss whether that's the case, how it might be done, and so on. The orthodoxy in the United States didn't want to have that conversation, which is typical of orthodoxies, so there has to be a bit of a fight. So you are, or at least let me ask you to react to the notion, you are in a bit of a fight with the profession to open it up.
Yeah, we're trying to just follow those historical moments that I mentioned before in terms of opening up a discipline that has been very, very explicit in the way it demeanors alternative perspectives and how it basically has developed a self-referential framework in terms of the institutions like universities, academic journals, systems of evaluating promotions within departments, and in the worst case, it's just making life impossible for alternatives. So just to give you an example of one school within heterodoxy that you mentioned, Marxism, in the 1950s and 60s, my understanding is that there was just one tenured professor in the United States, which turned out to be one of your professors, Paul Baran, in Stanford. And my understanding is that they made his life impossible, giving him all types of trouble just to make his life hell. While at the same time celebrating like, hey, we have a token Marxist here. What are you talking about? We have alternative perspectives. So we're trying to break open by not having a token heterodox or radical political economics, but having a whole institution based on it. So if you look at the composition of our faculty, you'll see that many of them actually come from institutions that explicitly expose their students at the undergraduate and graduate level to alternatives to the mainstream.
So that brings me to my next question. Yours is not going to then be the only place in America where a student can learn more than the orthodoxy. There are others. You are adding to them, is that correct?
Yeah, we're just part of a tradition of dissent. I guess that something that does separate us is that in many heterodox departments, without mentioning names, that actually celebrate their heterodoxy at the graduate level. When it comes to undergraduate teaching, they're more or less still pretty standard. So our starting point was heterodoxy from the undergraduate level, and now, thanks again to the work of many of our colleagues and the support of the administration, now we're offering the same alternative now at the more advanced graduate level of the master's degree.
What's your argument for a student who might be considering where he or she is going to do master's level economic studies? Why should such a student, in your judgment, choose a heterodox program? What are the advantages that make that a more desirable choice than going to the conventional, the more conventional route?
Well, just to use the concrete example of our own students at the undergraduate level, most of our students come from a working class background. I say that because in a sense, like in classes like political economy, where they're exposed to Karl Marx and his thought, in a sense, we're not teaching them anything new. They know and they feel and they understand that what's written in that book, written 150 years ago, pretty much describes many of the things that they have to pass through in their everyday lives. What the book does is to organize those experiences that they have in a coherent way that also makes them feel empathy and with others that are either in their same workplace, outside of New York City, and around the world, to understand the system as a whole and the reality like that. And our experience has been that students get very excited about it. They want to go into things like journalism. They want to encounter alternative viewpoints, be it in politics, culture, economics, with the grounding that they have theoretically in alternative economic theories. So some of them want to confront the world. Other students, for example, just are very sincere. They want to make a lot of money, and they understand, like, if I want to make a lot of money, I have to understand how the system works. So it might sound like a paradox or contradiction, but many people who go into finance also benefit from reading Karl Marx. That's something that, well, should be a topic for another program. We have, in terms of the background of our graduate students, we have not only do they not come half of them from economics, they come from sociology, anthropology. So we also focus on the interdisciplinary aspect of a heterodox education, which provides basically the tools to go out to the world and be a critical, well-rounded citizen that actively seeks to intervene in this world that is falling apart, which is part of our mission. Try to combat those tendencies right now. So it's an uphill struggle, but we benefit from the types of students that we have. And we have benefited from the students that have come from outside of John Jay College, outside of the CUNY system, that are interested in this. And in terms of job prospects, it goes all over the place, from continuing work at the PhD level, working for government organizations, non-governmental organizations, journalism. We have a couple of journalists, one of them for a sister institution of Economic Update, the Left Out podcast, Dante Dalla Valle. We have another journalist writing for The Intercept, very good pieces on the crisis in Puerto Rico. Her name is Kate Aronoff. We have another graduate student. His name is Nathan Tankus, who has been cited by one of your guests here, Stephanie Kelton. So we have a very interesting group and rich environment to push the boundaries of the discipline in terms of alternatives within economics and outside the spectrum of the discipline itself.
Let me ask you, because sometimes when I talk to people about heterodox economics, I get the impression that they think if you're interested in that, it will bring you into tremendous conflict either with the administrations of universities or make it difficult for your graduates to get jobs. Let me ask you then about this. Is there a problem in the CUNY system, the City University of New York, with your going in this direction? Has that occasioned any difficulty, or do they welcome this kind of opening?
Well, our immediate experience, not even at the graduate level, at the undergraduate level, is that we've graduated students, sent them to sister departments. They come back, work for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Some of them come back and teach for us. So the opportunities are there, and the employers are also interested in precisely a broader spectrum of analysis. Not this, mass production of the same. Yeah. That's what the education system usually, pops out on a yearly basis. So even though there's, of course, the constraints of public education, the cuts in public spending, funding, and all of that, which of course amounts to real constraints. We're working through those things. So our students do have the opportunities. We have the anecdotal evidence that they will not be wasting their times either professionally in terms of, again, making a buck or contesting the system itself.
So it hasn't been a problem for your graduates. What about the university administration? Is this okay?
Well,
because sometimes professors who might want to go in that direction are frightened that they will encounter some sort of disapproval if they do that.
Well, our program in part has been a product of a turn at John Jay College towards more of a liberal arts education. So in that sense, the economics department was more than welcome. And then within the context of the crisis, this heterodox approach, even, open arms to us. So at least within the John Jay College, that has not been a problem at all. It's been very supportive. We have lots of fantastic colleagues from other departments that are very supportive, extremely supportive. So far, no major, stumbling blocks along the way.
Tell me a little bit so that people understand about your students at John Jay. And I would guess they're not all that different from the students that come to many of the campuses of the City University of New York. How does your program, in a sense, at least in part, focus on what they need and who they are?
So the topics addressed in the department, topics like inequality, poverty, instability in the job, household dynamics, international dynamics, all of these things are part of the experiences of our students. Many of them are, for example, the first member in their family to go to college. Many of them are the main source of income of their family. So that's very common throughout the CUNY system, very common at John Jay, which is also a Hispanic serving institution. A substantial amount of students are, from Hispanic background and all of that. So they have to deal with things like immigration in terms of the history of their families. So we deal with those things within the current context of the Trump administration and within the larger context of the historical development of the United States and the development of global capitalism. So in that sense, we're directly connected with those experiences in terms of precisely providing theories that actually do explicitly address those problems. So if you take some, versions of the mainstream, they will tell you inequality doesn't matter. What's really important is poverty. So we tackle those problems. We show them what does it mean to make that. What consequences does it have in terms of the workings of the system at the economic level, at the political level, etc. So in that sense, we think that we're very relevant to their daily experiences, both individually in relationship to their families, etc., their neighborhoods, etc.
It strikes me listening to you that when I went to college, I tried to take some economics courses because I was so interested in what was happening to the economy. But I found them utterly irrelevant. They were all mathematical, technical exercises. Since I had come from a background in the natural sciences and mathematics, I was basically blown away by the fact that economics, the way it was taught to me, was more like an engineering course and didn't talk about the current problems that I was interested in. And so I tended to shy away. I had to come back. I studied economics despite the way it was taught, not because of it. I would have been enthralled by a program that began by saying the student has a whole raft of economic realities he and she have to wrestle with. A good economics education begins by dealing with those and facing those and drawing out different ways of explaining those so that people really can get a handle on their own situation. If that's what you're trying to do, then it's not just a disagreement with orthodoxy. It really is a different philosophy of education.
Yeah, that was my experience also, even though I came from a business school background.
Yourself?
Myself, yeah. And, the class that hooked me up to economics was a course on business cycles. And then I went to do a master's degree, and I got exposed to that fetishism, let's call it, of the tools that economists are taught. So just to give you a quick example of how this manifested, I was present in a master's thesis dissertation where the topic was the socioeconomic determinants of crime in Puerto Rico. And, when you see that type of title, usually it means that they're going to use statistics, econometrics, identify certain variables, find the data through time, run a regression, check which of the variables are statistically significant, and then make a story about it. The person presenting the topic found that the level of income was not statistically significant, so he proceeded to write his whole master's thesis on the basis of that. When he presented his thesis, somebody raised his hands, a political economist actually that was taught in a heterodox department, Argeo Quiñones, a dear colleague and professor that you know in Puerto Rico. And he asked a question like, you're saying that this variable, the level of income in relationship to how you're defining crime is not important, but if you actually look at the people who are in jail for committing the crime as you described it, they clearly are part of the profile of this strata of the income. How do you deal with that? That didn't even pass through the head of the person, and the advisor, who was a renowned economist, whose hero is somebody like Gary Becker, trained at the University of Chicago. So it's clear that they don't have these sensibilities for asking the right questions, and they just let the theory, vomit reality without questioning the method, the tools, or being even conscious that there are alternative ways and methods of doing stuff. So that consciousness is also very important for us in exposing our students to alternative viewpoints.
It makes you wonder when you hear stories like this, whether the real function of economics, the orthodoxy, really wasn't to understand what's going on, but to justify it, to celebrate it, to make it all look terribly well organized, beyond improvement. It's remarkable. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for introducing our audience to the Heterodox idea and the Heterodox program that you're developing. And I wish you every success in attracting students and in giving them the benefit of this kind of openness. So thank you very much, Ian, for coming.
Thank you so much, Rick, and to your audience. And please tune in and search for our department, John Jay College, City University of New York, Economics Department.
Good. Thank you, folks. I want to also thank all of you for participating, for listening, for watching. I want to thank you to be partners of us, to share what you get on this program with other people through all the mechanisms of social media and in your daily conversation with family members, co-workers, and so forth. I want to also thank truthout.org, that remarkable independent source of news and analysis that's been a partner with Economic Update for many, many years. And I look forward to speaking with you again next week.